In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about exercises for lower back pain, but we're now going to be focusing on upper spine health. So I've talked a lot about, in past tutorials, about good and well moving hips and sort of healthy hips and being able to move from the hip and activating the glutes and so on and so forth. So I've talked about those, but I haven't talked about what needs to go on in the upper spine, because we've got the upper spine and then you've got that lower spinal curve and then it comes down into the hips. So what we're basically looking at is the joint below, which we've done a lot of, where we talked about the hips and being able to move from the hips, so on and so forth. We've talked about maintaining the neutral posture of the spine. What we're now going to talk about is the joint above. So we're looking at the joint above and we have looked at the joint below. Now, much the same as with the hips, if the hips aren't moving correctly, something's got to pick up the slack. Sometimes it can be the lower back, and it's the exact same when we look at the upper back. The upper back, if it's not moving well, it can put pressure on the joint below. So if we've got poor moving hips and a stiff upper spine, then that's just going to be adding more stress onto the lower part of the spine, and it will pick up any slack and it will compensate where it can compensate. So what we need to be able to do is build that upper spine health. Now, if you want to build the health of your hips, then please do go and look at past videos of mine where I've talked about that. There are plenty on there. Exercises for lower back pain and stretches for lower back pain is all about getting the hips moving properly and moving from there so you can take the stress away from the lower back. So what we're going to do, we are going to look at two parts to this. So we're going to look at what is essentially like a stretch or a mobility exercise for the upper back. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move into an exercise which can mobilize again and take the stretch and the mobilizing exercise a step further and make it a little bit more active, so you're able to create the movement of the upper back with the stretch and the mobility. So you create the space and then you start moving within that new space that you're creating using the stretch and the mobility exercise. So what we'll do is we'll get stuck into that right now. The stretch we're going to do requires a mat if you want to have sort of a softer thing under your knees, and we just need a raised surface. Now obviously I'm using a bench because I'm in a gym environment, but you could use a chair, a step, anything that is sort of raised up. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down onto the knees. Now we need this bench close enough, because what we want to do is we want to place the elbows on the bench. We place the elbows on the bench, the head goes in between the arms, and what that will do, where we've got sort of an outward curve of the upper spine, it's going to flatten that off and extend it. Now again, we want to be trying to maintain neutral posture through the lumbar spine, so we aren't compensating through there. So we don't need to be too aggressive with the stretch, we just need to get into it and make sure that we are extending the upper spine whilst maintaining the position of the lower spine. So elbows go on the bench, and then we go down in to that position. Give yourselves plenty of room so you can hinge at the hip, because again, that could affect what's happening at the lower back. So make sure you've got the correct width that you need. Use your feel for that, so it'll feel right when it's in the right position. It'll feel hard to hold the position when you're in the wrong position. So we come down into there, so we're holding, we don't drop the head, we keep the head up, and then we allow that to go down into that position. Now what I'm doing with my hands is I'm just trying to keep my forearms vertical, so I'm just pushing my fingers together to stop me going into that internally rotated position. So I want to stay in that position. So that's a nice easy stretch to start doing. So what that will do, that will start opening up the upper back. What we're now going to look at is just a nice simple exercise to then start mobilizing what we've started opening up, and see if we can create a little bit more space with a bit of extra movement. For the mobility exercise, all that we need is, well, I've got a foam roller there, but it could just be like a pillow rolled up, but it's something that you can arch back over. That's what we would be looking for. So we just set that down we place the roller at the sort of the bottom of the ribs. So we're not on the lower back, we're still on the upper back. And then you can place one hand behind the head, and then we're just arching back over it, coming back up. Again, what we're trying to do is keep the abdominals tight. Then we come down, roll back over it, come up, roll down, roll back over it, roll down, roll back over it. So we're doing it also in segments. Now, you could do sort of 3 or 4 repetitions of all of those. So you start at the middle part of the back, 1, 2, 3, and then go through that 3 or 4 times. Just trying to mobilize the spine to be able to extend that bit further. And then this type of thing will help with anything where you need to lift over the head, because when we lift over the head, if we don't have the thoracic extension, we can't get the arms up very high because we're pulled down, and you can see here my arms only go that high, but if I can stand up straight, they go that much higher. Now if we're stiff here, what we could do is that, which then puts pressure on the lower back. So that's one of the reasons why we would use an exercise like that. So what we're focusing on is not just staying in one position on the foam roller, starting lower, roll back, come up. You could even do back and forth a few times. So you could start low like this and sort of do 1, 2, 3, move down the spine. So again, what we're looking for is the lumbar spine to stay in position. So 1, 2, 3, and then we move up. So you can do it 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, if that makes sense. So that's the stretch that we've got. We've got a little bit of mobility. What we're now going to look at is an exercise that you can use as well. The exercise we're using is very simple. We're going to be down on one knee, and we're going to be moving this cable. Now, the weight doesn't need to be heavy because we're not focused on it being a hard lifting exercise. What we're focusing on is the rotation of the shoulders. The head wants to stay forward, the hips want to stay forward, and then we rotate through that sort of mid to upper spine to get that movement. What will also happen is when we come down onto one knee, because our arms will be over our head, we'll get that extension, but we'll also get the rotation as well, which are basically the 2 movements of the upper spine, rotation and extension. So we get both of those. So what we've just done with the stretch and the mobility exercise is we just created some extra space. The exercise now is going to allow the brain to learn that it's got extra space. So what we want to do, the first thing with any exercise when we're down on one knee, is to make sure we've got a good base of support. So we're on train tracks. So I would say train tracks or tightrope. Tightrope is a lot harder because it requires a lot more balance. We aren't really focusing on the balance part of it at the moment. We just want the rotation. So what we would do is we would come into this type of position on our train tracks. We've got the hips pointing forward. We've got the head pointing forward. What we would then do is we would grab onto a weight like this, and then we would now have, so if I now turn my head, my chest is pointing this way, and then as I pull down, chest is pointing to the front, but then as I come across, chest is now pointing in that direction. So we've got that rotation and extension as we come into that position and across. So we've got the rotation, we've got the extension that we've been creating. Now you might find early on that you don't get a great deal of movement, so your range of movement, it's not important that you go all the way to the top and all the way to the bottom. You work within your range of movement, and as it starts to open up, you can then sort of go further with that. Now, you don't need a cable machine to do that. You could have a light dumbbell or a light bag. You could use a rucksack with a few kilos in it, because all you would then look for would be a similar sort of thing. head forward, hips forward. And then we would just have a light weight down here. Again, we would come up. So we're pointing in that direction. We're coming up, we're pointing forward, and then we're pointing in that direction. All the time, the head. So we're working like so, and then we would swap round and do the same the other way. So we do the same amount of reps. So that's just a nice, simple, I guess you could say routine. We've got a stretch, we've got a mobility exercise, and we've got an exercise. And as I mentioned, you can use a cable. You could even just use body weight like I did then, or you could have a light weight in your hands just to help with some balance and with some stability that would come with that. To quickly summarize what we've covered in this tutorial, so we talked about a stretch, a mobility exercise, and a more active lifting or pulling exercise that we would do for the upper spine health. And the reason that we're doing that is because not only are good hips helpful to take pressure away from the lower spine, but also the upper spine, good health of the mid to upper spine is good for lower back health. For the simple reason, muscles activate better and it takes the stress away because we won't be compensating if we can't move at the upper back. So if we've got good hips, we've got good moving upper spine. Now this doesn't mean you need to be like a gymnast and you need to be flexible and have the best flexibility in the world. It just means you need to improve it and you need to have better movement of the upper spine that is good for you. That will then start to reduce stress on the lower back, and that's how it will be helpful. The stretch that we used was just very simple, putting elbows onto a bench, head in between the arms, and then that just starts to extend and flatten the thoracic spine. The mobility exercise we used was with a foam roller, led down, just doing reps of extending the thoracic spine over the roller, so you're then able to create a little bit more space. And then once we've created that space using those stretch and mobility exercise, we go on to a more active, like normal exercise where we use that space and try to teach the brain that that space is there and that it can use it, so it maintains that range of movement and that flexibility. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris. I will speak to you in the next tutorial.